This is usually the time when I stand up and introduce our second speaker, but then I'd just be talking to myself, and well, who wants that? So I'm here today to talk about the beer that some of you have been drinking today, our collaboration beer with Brew. Let me just start the clock here. Let me just make sure that my mic is on. Okay, everything seems all right. Okay, well, thank you everybody. Thank you, Brew, and for letting us go through this for this presentation on talking about Nerd Nite's Porter with my presentation titled, "So You Want to Brew a Beer, Man." This was intended to be a play on the words from that song from Frozen, but I don't think a lot of people got it, but now you know. Okay, so basic information, the Nerd Nite's Porter. I think some of you have been enjoying it, I hope. I hope somebody's enjoying it. Just because I'm here, you don't have to be nice. If you don't like it or if you have criticism about it, go ahead and talk about it. But yeah, so here's some of the basic information behind it that you don't get on the board or on the menu. It's about ABV, which is the alcohol by volume. It's the alcohol percentage is 3.4. It's a low alcohol beer, which makes it what we call a micro porter. The types of hops and malt we use makes it an American porter. So it's there's like British porters, there's different kinds of porters, but this is an American porter we have 6 different kinds of malts, which we'll get into a little bit, that have been used, and then 3 different kinds of hops that have been used. We'll get into that a little later. And your yeast is your standard, your standard British ale yeast, your Lallemand Windsor. As you can see, the idea of it, well, at least from my interpretation, my inspiration of the flavor and the profile, is a mellow, malt-forward porter with a mild citrus funk, well-balanced with a minor woody and coconut aroma. That was kind of my interpretation of this as we were building this beer. So how did this come about, right? So this is I used your picture from our previous Nerd Nite, yeah. So Nerd Nite Porter started out, began around November when Wataru-san said, "Hey, do you want to brew a beer, man?" And then so I went back, formulated a recipe, talked with Lori about, hey, what kind of beer do we want to make? Made a recipe, and then the first brew day was on January 24th, last month. It was dry hopped, where it was basically, this is when you add additional hops after you finish brewing it and fermenting it, on 3 days later. And then it was kegged just on Friday. So it's what Japanese like to call shinsen na biru. So what was the vision? What was the original vision for Nerd Nite's Porter? What was I thinking like this when saying like, hey, you want to brew a beer? It's like, okay, well, we have to think of the recipe, what kind of ingredients we use. But here's what I was thinking, like, okay, well, we were going to make it. Well, I wanted to make a porter. Wanted a dark beer, something a little bit more complex, something that's not a little bit out of the ordinary, but something low alcohol, intending so you can drink a lot of it during Nerd Nite and still be conscious and asking questions during the event. Something that's malt forward and complex, because just because it's low alcohol doesn't mean it has to be simple. So we can make it a little bit complex, and then the hops basically I wanted to have a combination of a traditional citrusy hops and a combination of newer fruity hops. We'll get into this a little bit later. So, how do we do it? Well, the basic 4 ingredients of a beer is right here. Right next to me right here. We have our malt or malted barley, our hops, right here. There's like literally like 8 pellets in here. Our hops, our brewer's yeast here. That's a big block of it. And water, which I'm going to have some right now. Those are the 4 basic main ingredients to make a beer. Yes, there's like different adjuncts and stuff, but depending on how you manipulate everything, depending on the ingredients you use on each of these components, you can change what kind of beer you make. So how do we implement all of these based on this vision according to the ingredients? Well, yeah, each of these sections, can be labeled on where we can manipulate the ingredients to change the style. We have, the malt. The malt can determine if it's a porter. It can also determine the alcohol percentage, as well as the yeast that you use can determine the alcohol percentage. If we want a malt forward, obviously we need to use different kinds of malt. And then the hops obviously goes into the style of the hops, the floral, the bitterness, the little different flavors of the hoppiness that comes with the beer. So let's start in the beginning. The malt, your base, right here. These little grains here. The malt basically at the end of the day, provides the sugar for the beer that, if you remember your basic biology classes, the yeast uses the sugar to make alcohol and CO2, right? So depending on how much malt you use, it can determine how much alcohol you end up with. It also provides the foundational flavor and the foundational color of your beer. We're going to a lot of people are nodding ahead, and I think people know about the constitutive of general parts of the beer. So bear with me. This is going to be little surface stuff. But yeah, so your color also determines. And then, okay, how do you get if it looks like this? If your malt kind of looks like this, then why is your color why does it end up black like that? Well, that comes down to basically, what are the components we can change. We already went through this a little bit, how we can manipulate the malts to make this kind of vision. But so, there are over 300 commercially available grains that you can use. And they have different types of flavors, color profiles, just it's nuts if you just look at our list of the types of malt, because it's not just malts as in your foundation like this, but it's different types of grains as well. I think you can put rice in here as well. And so each of these, what you see here, these are the six malts we used for the Nerd Nite's Porter, all have different kinds of flavor profiles and characteristics. This is an example of what the Munich. This is the flavor profile of the Munich malt here. So there's a lot of these. There's bready, coffee, bitter, dark caramel, biscuit, honey, right? There's all these different flavor profiles depending on your malt. So basically, when trying to think about what do I put in this beer, I was thinking, okay, what can we use to make these kinds of flavors? So first part is your pale malt. This is your base. Well, actually, these two are the base, but the pale malt is your fundamental, your bread and butter. It provides most of the sugar of the beer. It provides most of the base flavor of it. So you can't go, there's no way of changing or manipulating that. The Munich malt is also the same. It's kind of a base malt, but it has a very powerful malt flavor, and it also provides some additional sugars into it as well. And then these four here are more of your additional. It adds different characters, adds different colors, adds different more malty flavors. You have your Munich malt, your biscuit malt that adds as the name implies, more biscuity flavor. Your caramel crystal malt enhances the malt flavor, a little bit of more caramel-like flavors into it. We saw that chart in the back. Munich also adds a little bit of a caramel aroma. It also adds a little bit more complex sugars, adds a little bit more of a body to the flavoring. And then chocolate malt, which, as you can imagine, has a little bit of a sense of chocolate, but it's also very dark, so it provides a lot of the dark coloration into the beer itself. You can probably ask Wataru-san if you have samples of each of these and what they each kind of look like. And this is basically the grain percentage build that we used for this. So generally, about a 200 liter brew house. Was it 200 liter? Okay. Yeah, about 200 liter brew house. We ended up with about 37 kilograms of malt in total. That's for low ABV beers. So Wataru-san had to grind those and we had to haul it in. Usually 50 to 60 if you want your normal 5%, your 6% style beers. So relatively low amount of beer, of grain that we use in this kind of percentage. So next, this is one of my favorite parts. Hops, your bitter buddy. So hops, obviously, we know is what makes the beer bitter. It's your little, well, these are in pellets, but they kind of look like this usually. Yeah, and expensive, I know. And you can't grow really good ones in Japan right now either, which kind of sucks. But for hops, there are also hundreds of different categories of hops. There's over 250 cataloged varieties of hops. In some places, I saw over 300 that are commercially available. I think that's insane. And like every year, there's like a bunch that people come up with because you can just crossbreed these like no other. And they also have very distinct flavors that are very different from what you have with your malt. You know, your bitter is definitely one thing, but like citrus, tropical fruit, stone fruit, berry, floral, grassy, herbal, spicy, resiny, piney, right? All these different flavors are characteristics of all these different kinds of hops. But at the fundamental level, it provides the aroma, the flavor, and the bitterness to your beer, right? So hops themselves also has a subcategory in like their usage. There are bittering hops and aroma hops. And I guess if you want a third category, if you can use both and make like dual hops. But like they're divided into two distinct varieties. Bittering hops, as the name suggests, are more akin to use to bitter your beer. It's chemical components in there that's like more, you know, if you want to make your bitter beers, you use more bittering hops. Aroma hops, on the other hand, are more suited to give your sense the flavor, the smell of the hops that you want to use in your beer. So depending on what kind of beer you want to make, you can use different kinds of bittering and different kind of aroma hops, or in cases, you can use dual use hops, which do both jobs really well. Okay, so we're back to this, back to the vision. What am I thinking? So we want something in the hops section. I wanted a combination in our porter to be a traditional citrusy hop and have also newer fruity hops. I say newer fruity hops because these like fruity hop flavors and aromas that you get with like hazy IPAs, they're relatively newer hops, or newer in use hops, I suppose. I first drank craft beer when I was in college in Oregon, and so a lot of so my go home is your West Coast styles, your bitters, your nice citrusies, your Cascades, your Columbuses, your really skunky ass beers that are my kind of favorite. So I wanted to put that. Nobody said I was trying to cater to an audience here. But then, of course, we're in a new age. I know what the trends are looking. So we wanted to try something with newer, fruitier hops, right? And so that's basically let's look at the kind of hops we want to use for that. And so we went with 3. Actually, Watanabe was a big help in trying to determine which one to use for this. Columbus, Cascade, and Sabro. Columbus and Cascade are essentially dual-use hops, so good for smell and bitterness. Sabro, on the other hand, is good for aroma. These two, Columbus and Cascades, are your more traditional ones, while Sabro is your more newer, sweeter, fruity hop. Some of the distinctive flavor profiles for Columbus and Cascade, as you can see here, like I said, your more traditional spicy, your herbalies, your citrusies, your slight spices, your florals. These are Columbus and Cascades have these kinds of distinct flavors and smells to them. On the other hand, Sabro is much more good. It's not good to use for bittering. You'll end up with a really very earthy beer itself. But Sabro is very sweet, is sweet fruity as well. When I read some of the literature, was it has hints of cedar, mint, and cream in it, which is quite a not. If you have samples, Wadara-san, of Saburo hops, and Cascade hops, you give a whiff of the two, you can probably get a very good distinct smell in this. By the way, which one is this? This is Saburo. Okay, this is Saburo hops too. Okay, so you can pass that around and see, give that a smell. Very kind of distinct, I think. So that's our hops. Those are the 3 hops we used we're going to use that into our beer. Finally, yeast. Beautiful yeast. Yeast our worker. We can go, I can go for 20, 30 minutes just talking about yeast and these microorganisms. Oh, these guys are fun. So in yeast itself, there are over 400 yeasts for beer alone. Like there are literal research divisions dedicated to developing yeast, everything. But for brewing specifically, for beer brewing specifically, there are about 400 cataloged that you can use. Now, that's only what's used publicly. There are some that are like, what they call like kiyokobo, like for use like proprietary. There's like proprietary strains of yeast as well, which is really interesting. But as we explained, this converts the sugar in your beer that is produced by the malt and makes it, and uses it as energy and produces alcohol and CO2 as a waste product. Now, therefore, it really does determine your alcohol percentage, is how much sugar you have and how much yeast and what your yeast can do. Yeast can also add a lot of different additional flavors as well. There's a lot of different strains out there now where you can use at different temperatures or different styles that really like pull out a lot of the different kinds of smells distinctive just because the type of yeast you have present. So going back to our vision here, what parts here get determined by the yeast? Is the alcohol percentage. I wasn't going to play around with different kinds of yeast. This your standard ale yeast is this is Quebec yeast too. Cool. So this is an interesting one too. We can talk about later if we have time. But yeah, so I wanted a low alcohol beer that you can just keep drinking for Nerd Night. So let's not do anything fancy. Let's go with standard brewer's yeast with low to mid attenuation. Basically, how genki the yeast is. Like if you have a high attenuation yeast, it's really genki. It'll use all that sugar up and make alcohol and CO2. If you have mid to low attenuation beer, it'll just use some of that. You'll have some of the sugars left in your beer so that you can keep it in a body and keep the alcohol percentage down. So what we used for this one is your standard Lallemand Windsor. That's the company yeast. Your Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is the name of your standard ale yeast. It's a British style ale yeast. It has mid attenuation, and it is known to be good for porters, ales, IPAs, etc. So nothing fancy. You're very kihonteki yeast.
Do you know how much is in this batch?
何グラム使いましたっけ? It's like a big cup. 200 grams. And これ何グラムだっけ? This is 500 grams. So just dump it in the box and throw it in. Yeah, and basically we can we're not going to go through water chemistry today because that's an entire subject and literal books have been written about it. But that is basically the impetus and the ingredients chosen to build the Nerd Nite Porter. It is. I think it turned out great. I think it was. I'm very happy for and thankful for Wataru-san for this opportunity. I was also thank James from the Penguin who looked at the recipe first and added suggestions. Like any creative endeavor, it's not just a solo thing. There's a lot of people involved with this. So please, thank you very much for drinking the beer. Thank you very much for coming to Nerd Night today. Thank you to Wataru and Brew for letting us use this. And that is the end of my talk. Oh, good. Okay, we have a little bit of time for some questions. Does anybody want to look at the malt as well? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, that's Tsuro, right?
Tsuro.
Yeah, that's your Tsuro malt. So you're another standard, but also a little bit more.
Fundamental questions.
Yeah.
Two questions. One is, does it have to have hops to be considered beer?
So legally, I think in Japan, beer has to have water, malt, hop, and yeast, right? And there's certain percentages that you can set with that. But yes, legally, yes, it has. If you wanted, if in Japan, if you want to call it a biru, then it has to have hops in it. But that doesn't mean like, there are. God, I think like James was talking about this the other day too, of like these Nordic brewing methods of beer, and like, well, you don't grow hops that much there, so instead you use like pine needles and like adjuncts like that. And technically, since you are brewing from like a malt grain source and brewing it with yeast, you can consider it a beer, I suppose. But like the legal definition, yeah, it has to have hops in it.
Okay, so it's malted barley with hops. That's okay.
Malted barley, hops, yeast, yeah.
That answers the second question.
Yeah.
Which was going to be white hops. But you answered.
Sorry, we'll go then this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm curious. So I drink a lot of wine as well. So I'm curious, do you know anything about the difference, like the biochemistry between yeast used for beer making and yeast used for wine making?
Oh yeah, there's specifically wine yeast and beer yeast. So beer yeast it depends on the kind of beer yeast you use, but beer yeast can't really survive past like 8% alcohol concentration, right? So that's why you need to use like yeast that's specific that can tolerate high, because it's basically swimming in its own waste, right?
Yeah, right.
So you need stuff like that, plus different kind of flavor profiles. The base, ale yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
Yeah.
That's the one that's like, okay, I brew at this genki and I can only survive at that much.
Yeah. Yeah, so because I knew, for example, I know like when people say beer is yeasty, I think they come from maltose, right? Or is that, am I making a mistake?
Well, beers can be yeasty with like the
I
yeast
think,
smell in it.
I think wine yeast can't produce what maltose.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure.
I'm just curious about that. So.
Even there are cases where like people have used wine or like champagne yeast instead of beer, because champagne yeast is really funny. It makes really dry beer if you want to.
Interesting.
But and I think I have a packet at home too. Oh, don't tell anybody that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there have been cases of people using these. What happens when you throw wine yeast in a beer with varying results.
Very interesting.
Sorry, you had a question.
I was going to ask how long the fermentation process was to make.
This was really quick. 3日4日ぐらいで発酵は yeah, fermentation. About 5 days. Yeah, so this was relatively low alcohol, so wasn't a lot of fermentation going on anyway. So generally, yeah, about 5 days to completion, and then
5 days to 7.
yeah. So usually beers in this case, it takes about a week, 10 days. This got it for fermentation, unless you use these guys.
2 days.
Yeah, these guys. This is why it's like Quebec yeast. I was looking at this. Oh, like this is a newer kind of yeast that like you can do it at higher temperatures, and it'll like blast through it in 2 days. So if you want to do a quick turnaround, these are good ones. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I have my like notes from the day, so if you want to check them out too.
So I have a question. We're talking about beer with James.
Yeah.
He said, recipe or planning of the how to brew beer is very logical. Do you think that it's true?
Well, I literally made a 20-minute presentation,
Yeah.
right?
When you come up with this recipe, and the final product is just as you thought it would be.
Ooh. Sometimes it's not. It is logic. It's basically like any kind of form of cooking, right? Like you have your ingredients, you follow the instructions. We didn't even go through like the brewing process today, because that could change like what the beer style and flavor is, like high temperature, lower temperature. So yeah, in the sense of like choosing the ingredients is a very logical thing. It's like, oh, it's going to be a stout, a black beer. Okay, then these are the ingredients that go into a dark beer. Depending on how your ratio or the other types of ingredients you use in that could change the beer. But yeah, at the basic component, it's just 4 ingredients, right? This is very light. Yes. No, go ahead.
Very basic. Like the malt is it's a local produce or imported.
It's all imported, I think, right? 全部外から入れてるやつですよね。輸入です。 Except the water. I think the water is from here.
And my second question, because you talk about four ingredients. You mentioned all the yeast and the hop and the malt, but you didn't talk about the water.
Yeah.
The water is really important.
Oh God, yeah. Water is what 90% of the actual beer. So.
I mean, know the quality of the water. Because I took the class from the Wageningen University. We talk about signing up beer.
Yeah.
You kind of missed one of them.
That's right, because depending on the minerals you have in the water, I mean, even making different from making an ale to even a lager, you want to change, things like your the pH tends to be like slightly low. You can change pH for certain styles of beer. Like certain styles of beer require certain pH. Calcium carbonate. What's the other one? Here it is. See, this is what I have here. Calcium chloride, calcium sulfate, which is basically sulfide, which is basically gypsum. Depending on like your calcium levels in your beer, you can like pull out much more of the bitterness, or if you put like sulfite levels, your sugarness, your sugar, your little like you can kind of tamp down off flavors if you want to too. So yeah, like there are books about yes, right? Am I right? Okay, good. I can't bullshit my way through this because he's gonna comment. but a benefit is generally the water coming from here in Fukuoka, it's clean water. It's well treated. It generally doesn't have anything in it, so you can add stuff into it when you want to, right? So in this case, when we brewed this beer, we added a few more minerals in here. Just
Japan, they got a lot of spring water.
Yeah. And so like a lot of places in like Nihonshu, big thing when it comes to like switching, which is really switching because what's funny, I'm from Kansai. I grew up in Kobe. Kobe has nada, which has lots of sake there, right? But I lived in Kyoto. Kyoto's got like fushimi. Wait, fushimi? Was it? Fushimi, right? And Kyoto sake, if you're familiar, is like known to be like sweeter sake, like onnazake, I think they want to call it. While Kobe is like otokozake, which is like drier, little harsher. That's because it's the water source that they use is different. Fushimi uses a lot of groundwater that's filtered out. Nada uses a lot of water coming from Rokko, a lot of high minerals.
The games nowadays, water will be controlled by
Nowadays you can control that. So when they say like, oh, it's from spring water, it's like, okay, yeah, sure, it's probably in the ground and pumped right back up. And like well water stuff. But all of this you can manipulate anyway. We're not in the age of like, oh, we can only get this kind of water here, so it's only this kind of beer gets made there. No, you can just pull the water chemistry and change it up. Water chemistry changes by season too, if you want to. So if you want to make a controlled like beer flavor, then it's inadvisable to like use well water that could change, right?
I would argue that, but when you manipulate the water, the taste of the beer is different.
Yes.
I agree you can manipulate anything. They have gym or we have gym editing, but the taste is completely different from the look of the water.
Yeah.
The way it's come out. I agree that you can manipulate.
It's more about just getting consistency. So when you do multiple batches of beer, you want consistent. So you put things into level 10.
Yeah, your Asahi that you drink here, the Asahi you drink in like Kuala Lumpur, is gonna taste like Asahi, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Simple question, but the British malt you said tasted like, biscuit malt tasted like biscuit. Is that UK biscuit or
Shit. Hold on. Let's see. ビスケットモルトはイギリスビスケット。It's British, so it's British biscuit, yeah.
For the Americans, cookies, basically.
It's cookies, yeah, drier cookies, nothing with them, yeah. Real dry one. So, yeah, you're very, very English, very dry, very almost stale, yeah. We'll go, yeah, you got it.
And the style is American porter, but you use the British yeast. What makes the style American? What makes British yeast can make American porter?
Oh, okay, so.
I thought the yeast decide the style, American or German or British.
From my understanding, not necessarily,
Really?
because it's the hops as well, and like the malt, like
The malt build.
and the malt, like because yes, we use igirisu. Yeah, it's like it's more like it's like hoppier than your British styles, right? So if you wanted to say if we like pulled out half of the hops, then it would be we could call it a British. Yeah. Nomenclature, right? Like the difference between a porter and a stout, there used to be like kind of a distinction. Like nowadays, nobody gives a fuck. I mean, you can call it, sure, if you want to call it traditional, yeah. But yeah, it's you're more.
Using British hops.
Yeah. So you can use, yeah, but you can use British hops, yeah. Exactly. So, but you can still call it a British porter if you want to. And yeah, go ahead.
So I have a passion for sourdough baking, which is actually fermentation, natural fermentation of making bread as such. And one of the fundamental ingredients is obviously the yeast that we use to ferment the dough. And we use yeast, which is the older the yeast, the more flavor it develops in the bread. To the extent that we, among sourdough bakers, we pass on from generation to generation a culture that has been fed and grown within the bakery as such. And there are yeast which are 100 years of age, which are still being used today to make bread. And so my question is there a similar process when you make beer where you reuse the yeast that has been used to actually make a new beer? Or you just got that and buy some?
Depending on your system and facility, there are places that reculture the yeast from their spent system. The thing is, a lot of like here, there's no place to like cultivate that. There's a lot, like 200 grams of that block needs to get used even for a 200 liter batch. So being able to cultivate that much yeast is, you don't have the facilities for a place even like this. Even your larger breweries say that, you're over at what's that one in Nakasuka? Aozora, yeah. Bigger places like Aozora, much bigger places like Suginoya does actually like reculture the yeast there because the guy there bought a fume hood and a clean bench and actually has an incubator that you can do that. But that's a lot more equipment you have to fit into a room like this, bigger room like this. So, and another thing also some people might argue is that as you said, when you do sourdough, every time you use it, the flavor does change. Do you want that to happen to your beer? Unless you want to make it, that's the gimmick of the beer. The beer brewing wants consistency. You want to go to a brewery and have like their teiban, their traditional beer, then you want to keep it at that same flavor. You can give it. I think it's a great experiment to run, and there are probably breweries that do that. I'm just not familiar with them, but I can imagine like these old traditional Bavarian or Belgian breweries who don't even pitch yeast. They just open up the door like in the ceiling of their brew house and just let the natural stuff come in. Yeah, that weird stick that if you mix up your sugar water in, it's like starts brewing. Yeah, it's like the stuff that's inoculated in that. Yeah, so that's definitely microbiology, man. It's amazing stuff.
This is what Marmite is, isn't it?
It's the spent yeast. Last question.
My bad. I'm sorry. We're over time over here. Sorry to stand up here. But follow up on the professor's question about like the logic of brewing beer. I've never brewed a beer before. I just worked as a beer tender a long ways back. But what was it 37 grams of malt?
Mm-hmm. Oh, for this one, 37 kilograms.
37 kilos, right? That's what I'm saying. 37 kilograms of malt, 200 liters.
Roughly, I think it ended up as a 230 liter batch.
A little over 200 grams.
Yeah.
Like 20 grams of yeast, right?
With 200 grams of yeast.
Oh, 200 grams of yeast, right? 200 grams of yeast. And that gives you this low ABV beer based on the yeast characteristics and the malt characteristics too. But if you wanted a 5% beer, like what's the ratio? I've never made a beer before, so
yeah.
Is there a golden ratio? Kind of like
I mean,
hops or malt.
I mean, yeah, you can like. add in a few more, add in a little bit more grain so you have more sugar. You can use the same yeast and the same amount of yeast. Generally, the amount of yeast, so long as you have like the threshold so that the yeast can actually propagate in the place, doesn't actually change the alcohol. It's more of insinuation.
The yeast is like the main. Because I was thinking it was the yeast and the malt that ratio.
It's more like the malt. It's also it's actually also the temperature at which you steep the malt at.
Right.
So higher
temp. Get more sugars out.
Yeah, lower temperatures get more sugars out. More sugars mean more yeast stuff. So it's also within the process as well. So I would say more malt, lower ABV temp, but same protocol with the yeast.
Higher temps is more sugars out.
No, lower temps gets more fermentable sugars out.
Gotcha. Otherwise it just
Yeah. Okay. We're over time. Leo, thank you very much. Okay, we'll take another 10-minute break, refresh your drinks. Now, maybe